The Versailles System and the Return to Normalcy. 1919 to 1929. The Peace Settlement, 1919 to 1923. Security, 1919 to 1935. Disarmament, 1919 to 1935. Reparations, 1919 to 1932. The Peace Settlements, 1919 to 1923. The First World War was ended by dozens of treaties signed in the period 1919–1923. Of these, the 5 chief documents were the 5 treaties of peace with the defeated powers, named from the sites in the neighborhood of Paris where they were signed. These were: Treaty of Versailles with Germany, June 28, 1919. Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria, September 10, 1919. Treaty of Neuilly with Bulgaria, November 27, 1919. Treaty of Trianon with Hungary, June 4, 1920. Treaty of Sabris with Turkey, August 20, 1920. The last of these, the Treaty of Sabris with Turkey, was never ratified and was replaced by a new treaty, signed at Lausanne in 1923. The peace settlements made in this period were subjected to vigorous and detailed criticism in the 2 decades 1919 to 1939. This criticism was as ardent from the victors as from the vanquished. Although this attack was largely aimed at the terms of the treaties, the real causes of the attack did not lie in these terms, which were neither unfair nor ruthless, were far more lenient than any settlement which might have emerged from a German victory, and which created a new Europe which was, at least politically, more just than the Europe of 1914. The causes of the discontent with the settlements of 1919 to 1923 rested on the procedures which were used to make these settlements rather than on the terms of the settlements themselves. Above all, there was discontent at the contrast between the procedures which were used and the procedures which pretended to be used, as well as between the high-minded principles which were supposed to be applied and those which really were applied. The peoples of the victorious nations had taken to heart their wartime propaganda about the rights of small nations, making the world safe for democracy, and putting an end both to power politics and to secret diplomacy. These ideals had been given concrete form in Wilson's 14 points. Whether the defeated powers felt the same enthusiasm for these high ideals is subject to dispute, but they had been promised, on November 5, 1918, that the peace settlements would be negotiated and would be based on the 14 points. When it became clear that the settlements were to be imposed rather than negotiated, that the 14 points had been lost in the confusion, and that the terms of the settlements had been reached by a process of secret negotiations from which the small nations had been excluded and in which power politics played a much larger role than the safety of democracy, there was a revulsion of feeling against the treaties. In Britain and in Germany, propaganda barrages were aimed against these settlements until, by 1929, most of the Western world had feelings of guilt and shame whenever they thought of the Treaty of Versailles. There was a good deal of sincerity in these feelings, especially in England and in the United States, but there was also a great deal of insincerity behind them in all countries. In England, the same groups, often the same people, who had made the wartime propaganda and the peace settlements were loudest in their complaint that the latter had fallen far below the ideals of the former, while all the while their real aims were to use power politics to the benefit of Britain. Certainly there were grounds for criticism, and, equally certainly, the terms of the peace settlements were far from perfect, but criticism should have been directed rather at the hypocrisy and lack of realism in the ideals of the wartime propaganda and at the lack of honesty of the chief negotiators in carrying on the pretense that these ideals were still in effect while they violated them daily, and necessarily violated them. The settlements were clearly made by secret negotiations, by the great powers exclusively, and by power politics. They had to be. No settlements could ever have been made on any other basis. The failure of the chief negotiators, at least the Anglo-Americans, to admit this is regrettable, but behind their reluctance to admit it is the even more regrettable fact that the lack of political experience and political education of the American and English electorates made it dangerous for the negotiators to admit the facts of life in international political relationships. It is clear that the peace settlements were made by an organization which was chaotic and by a procedure which was fraudulent. None of this was deliberate. It arose rather from weakness and from ignorance, from a failure to decide, before the peace was made, who would make it, how it was to be made, and on what principles it would be based. The normal way to make peace after a war in which the victors form a coalition would be for the victors to hold a conference, agree on the terms they hope to get from the defeated, then have a congress with these latter to impose these terms, either with or without discussion and compromise. It was tacitly assumed in October and November 1918 that this method was to be used to end the existing war. But this Congress method could not be used in 1919 for several reasons. The members of the victorious coalition were so numerous, 32 allied and associated powers, that they could have agreed on terms only slowly and after considerable preliminary organization. This preliminary organization never occurred, largely because President Wilson was too busy to participate in the process, was unwilling to delegate any real authority to others, and, with a relatively few, intensely held ideas like the League of Nations, democracy, and self-determination, had no taste for the details of organization. Wilson was convinced that if he could only get the League of Nations accepted, any undesirable details in the terms of the treaties could be remedied later through the League. Lloyd George and Clemenceau made use of this conviction to obtain numerous provisions in the terms which were undesirable to Wilson but highly desirable to them. The time necessary for a preliminary conference or preliminary planning was also lacking. Lloyd George wanted to carry out his campaign pledge of immediate demobilization, and Wilson wanted to get back to his duties as President of the United States. Moreover, if the terms had been drawn up at a preliminary conference, they would have resulted from compromises between the many powers concerned, and these compromises would have broken down as soon as any effort was made to negotiate with the Germans later. Since the Germans had been promised the right to negotiate, it became clear that the terms could not first be made the subject of public compromise in a full preliminary conference. Unfortunately, by the time the victorious great powers realized all this, and decided to make the terms by secret negotiations among themselves, invitations had already been sent to all the victorious powers to come to an inter-allied conference to make preliminary terms. As a solution to this embarrassing situation, the peace was made on two levels. On one level, in the full glare of publicity, the Inter-Allied Conference became the Plenary Peace Conference, and, with considerable fanfare, did nothing. On the other level, the great powers worked out their peace terms in secret and, when they were ready, imposed them simultaneously on the conference and on the Germans. This had not been intended. In fact, it was not clear to anyone just what was being done. As late as February 22, Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, still believed they were working on preliminary peace terms, and the Germans believed the same on April 15. While the great powers were negotiating in secret, the full conference met several times under rigid rules designed to prevent action. These sessions were governed by the iron hand of Clemenceau, who heard the motions he wanted, jammed through those he desired, and answered protests by outright threats to make peace without any consultation with the lesser powers at all and dark references to the millions of men the great powers had under arms. On February 14 the conference was given the draft of the Covenant of the League of Nations, and on April 11 the draft of the International Labour Office. Both were accepted on April 28. On May 6 came the text of the Treaty of Versailles, only one day before it was given to the Germans. At the end of May came the draft of the Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria. While this futile show was going on in public, the great powers were making peace in secret. Their meetings were highly informal. When the military leaders were present, the meetings were known as the Supreme War Council. When the military leaders were absent, as they usually were after January 12, the group was known as the Supreme Council or the Council of Ten. It consisted of the head of the government and the foreign minister of each of the five great powers, Britain, the United States, France, Italy, and Japan. This group met 4 to 6 times from January 12 to March 24, 1919. It worked very ineffectively. At the middle of March, because a sharp dispute over the German-Polish frontier leaked to the press, the Council of Ten was reduced to a Council of 4, Lloyd George, Wilson, Clemenceau, and Orlando. These four, with Orlando frequently absent, held over 200 meetings in a period of 13 weeks, March 27 to June 28. They put the Treaty of Versailles into form in 3 weeks and did the preliminary work on the treaty with Austria. When the treaty with Germany was signed on June 28, 1919, the heads of governments left Paris and the Council of Ten ended. So also did the plenary conference. The 5 foreign ministers, Balfour, Lansing, Pichon, Tittoni, and Mackinac, were left in Paris as the Council of Heads of Delegations, with full powers to complete the peace settlements. This group finished the treaties with Austria and Bulgaria and had them both signed. They disbanded on January 10, 1920, leaving behind an executive committee, the Conference of Ambassadors. This consisted of the ambassadors of the 4 great powers in Paris plus a French representative. This group held 200 meetings in the next 3 years and continued to meet until 1931. It supervised the execution of the 3 peace treaties already signed, negotiated the peace treaty with Hungary, and performed many purely political acts which had no treaty basis, such as drawing the Albanian frontier in November 1921. In general, in the decade after the peace conference, the Conference of Ambassadors was the organization by which the great powers ruled Europe. It acted with power, speed, and secrecy in all issues delegated to it. When issues arose which were too important to be treated in this way, the Supreme Council was occasionally reunited. This was done about 25 times in the 3 years 1920 to 1922, usually in regard to reparations, economic reconstruction, and acute political problems. The most important of these meetings of the Supreme Council were held at Paris, London, San Remo, Boulogne, and Spa in 1920, at Paris and London in 1921, and at Paris, Genoa, The Hague, and London in 1922. This valuable practice was ended by Britain in 1923 in protest against the French determination to use force to compel Germany to fulfill the reparations clauses of the peace treaty. At all of these meetings, as at the peace conference itself, the political leaders were assisted by groups of experts and interested persons, sometimes self-appointed. Many of these experts were members or associates of the international banking fraternity. At the Paris Peace Conference, the experts numbered thousands and were organized into official staffs by most countries, even before the war ended. These experts were of the greatest importance. They were formed into committees at Paris and given problem after problem, especially boundary problems, usually without any indication as to what principles should guide their decisions. The importance of these committees of experts can be seen in the fact that in every case but one where a committee of experts submitted a unanimous report, the Supreme Council accepted its recommendation and incorporated it in the treaty. In cases where the report was not unanimous, the problem was generally resubmitted to the experts for further consideration. The one case where a unanimous report was not accepted was concerned with the Polish corridor, the same issue which had forced the Supreme Council to be cut down to the Council of Four in 1919 and the issue which led to the Second World War 20 years later. In this case, the experts were much harsher on Germany than the final decision of the politicians. The treaty with Germany was made by the Council of Four, assembling the reports of the various committees, fitting the parts together, and ironing out various disagreements. The chief disagreements were over the size and nature of German reparations, the nature of German disarmament, the nature of the League of Nations, and the territorial settlements in 6 specific areas: the Polish corridor, Upper Silesia, the Saar, Fiume, the Rhineland, and Shantung. When the dispute over Fiume reached a peak, Wilson appealed to the Italian people over the heads of the Italian delegation at Paris, in the belief that the people were less nationalistic and more favorable to his idealistic principles than their rather hard-boiled delegation. This appeal was a failure, but the Italian delegation left the conference and returned to Rome in protest against Wilson's action. Thus the Italians were absent from Paris at the time that the German colonial territories were being distributed and, accordingly, did not obtain any colonies. Thus Italy failed to obtain compensation in Africa for the French and British gains in territory on that continent, as promised in the Treaty of London in 1915. This disappointment was given by Mussolini as one of the chief justifications for the Italian attack on Ethiopia in 1935. The Treaty of Versailles was presented to the plenary conference on May 6, 1919, and to the German delegation the next day. The conference was supposed to accept it without comment, but General Foch, commander-in-chief of the French armies and of the Entente forces in the war, made a severe attack on the treaty in regard to its provisions for enforcement. These provisions gave little more than the occupation of the Rhineland and 3 bridgeheads on the right bank of the Rhine as already existed under the armistice of November 11, 1918. According to the treaty, these areas were to be occupied for from 5 to 15 years to enforce a treaty whose substantive provisions required Germany to pay reparations for at least a generation and to remain disarmed forever. Foch insisted that he needed the left bank of the Rhine and the 3 bridgeheads on the right bank for at least 30 years. Clemenceau, as soon as the meeting was over, rebuked Foch for disrupting the harmony of the assembly, but Foch had put his finger on the weakest, yet most vital, portion of the treaty. The presentation of the text of the treaty to the Germans the next day was no happier. Having received the document, the chief of the German delegation, Foreign Minister Count Ulrich von Brockdorf-Rantzau, made a long speech in which he protested bitterly against the failure to negotiate and the violation of the pre-armistice commitments. As a deliberate insult to his listeners, he spoke from a seated position. The German delegation sent the victorious powers short notes of detailed criticism during May and exhaustive counter-proposals on May 29, running to pages of German text. These counter-proposals criticized the treaty, clause by clause, accused the victors of bad faith in violating the 14 points, and offered to accept the League of Nations, the disarmament sections, and reparations of 100,000 million marks if the Allies would withdraw any statement that Germany had, alone, caused the war and would readmit Germany to the world's markets. Most of the territorial changes were rejected except where they could be shown to be based on self-determination, thus adopting Wilson's point of view. These proposals led to one of the most severe crises of the conference as Lloyd George, who had been re-elected in December on his promise to the British people to squeeze Germany dry and had done his share in this direction from December to May, now began to fear that Germany would refuse to sign and adopt a passive resistance which would require the Allies to use force. Since the British armies were being disbanded, such a need of force would fall largely on the French and would be highly welcome to people like Foch who favoured duress against Germany. Lloyd George was afraid that any occupation of Germany by French armies would lead to complete French hegemony on the continent of Europe and that these occupation forces might never be withdrawn, having achieved, with British connivance, what Britain had fought so vigorously to prevent at the time of Louis XIV and Napoleon. In other words, the reduction in Germany's power as a consequence of her defeat was leading Britain back to her old balance of power policies under which Britain opposed the strongest power on the continent by building up the strength of the second strongest. At the same time, Lloyd George was eager to continue the British demobilization in order to satisfy the British people and to reduce the financial burden on Britain so that the country could balance its budget, deflate, and go back on the gold standard. For these reasons, Lloyd George suggested that the treaty be weakened by reducing the Rhineland occupation from 15 years to 2, that a plebiscite be held in Upper Silesia, which had been given to Poland, that Germany be admitted to the League of Nations at once, and that the reparations burden be reduced. He obtained only the plebiscite in Upper Silesia and certain other disputed areas, Wilson rejecting the other suggestions and upbraiding the Prime Minister for his sudden change of attitude. Accordingly, the Allied answer to the German counter-proposals, written by Philip Kerr, later Lord Lothian, made only minor modifications in the original terms, chiefly the addition of 5 plebiscites in Upper Silesia, Allenstein, Marienwerder, North Schleswig, and the Saar, of which the last was to be held in 1935, the others immediately. It also accused the Germans of sole guilt in causing the war and of inhuman practices during it, and gave them a 5-day ultimatum for signing the treaty as it stood. The German delegation at once returned to Germany and recommended a refusal to sign. The cabinet resigned rather than sign, but a new cabinet was formed of Catholics and Socialists. Both of these groups were fearful that an Allied invasion of Germany would lead to chaos and confusion which would encourage Bolshevism in the East and separatism in the West. They voted to sign if the articles on war guilt and war criminals could be struck from the treaty. When the Allies refused these concessions, the Catholic Centre Party voted 64-14 not to sign. At this critical moment, when rejection seemed certain, the High Command of the German Army, through Chief of Staff Wilhelm Gruner, ordered the cabinet to sign in order to prevent a military occupation of Germany. On June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination at Sarajevo, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles where the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871, the Treaty of Versailles was signed by all the delegations except the Chinese. The latter refused, in protest against the disposition of the pre-war German concessions in Shantung. The Austrian treaty was signed by a delegation headed by Karl Renner but only after the victors had rejected a claim that Austria was a succession state rather than a defeated power and had forced the country to change its name from the newly adopted German Austria to the title Republic of Austria. The new country was forbidden to make any movement toward union with Germany without the approval of the League of Nations. The Treaty of Neuilly was signed by a single Bulgarian delegate, the Peasants' Party leader Alexander Stambolisky. By this agreement Bulgaria lost Western Thrace, her outlet to the Aegean, which had been annexed from Turkey in 1912, as well as certain mountain passes in the west which were ceded from Bulgaria to Yugoslavia for strategic reasons. The Treaty of Trianon signed in 1920 was the most severe of the peace treaties and the most rigidly enforced. For these and other reasons Hungary was the most active political force for revision of treaties during the period 1924 to 1934 and was encouraged in this attitude by Italy from 1927 to 1934 in the hope that there might be profitable fishing in such troubled waters. Hungary had good reason to be discontented. The fall of the Habsburg dynasty in 1918 and the uprisings of the subject peoples of Hungary, like the Poles, Slovaks, Romanians, and Croatians, brought to power in Budapest a liberal government under Count Michael Carroll. This government was at once threatened by a Bolshevik uprising under Bela Kun. In order to protect itself, the Carroll government asked for an Allied occupation force until after the elections scheduled for April 1919. This request was refused by General Franchet d'Espery, under the influence of a reactionary Hungarian politician, Count Stephen Bethlen. The Carroll regime fell before the attacks of Bela Kun and the Romanians in consequence of lack of support from the West. After Bela Kun's reign of red terrorism, which lasted 6 months, March-August, 1920, and his flight before a Romanian invasion of Hungary, the reactionaries came to power with Admiral Miklos Horthy as regent and head of the state, 1920 to 1944, and Count Bethlen as prime minister, 1921 to 1931. Count Carroll, who was pro-Allied, anti-German, pacifist, democratic, and liberal, realized that no progress was possible in Hungary without some solution of the agrarian question and the peasant discontent arising from the monopolization of the land. Because the Allies refused to support this program, Hungary fell into the hands of Horthy and Bethlen, who were anti-Allied, pro-German, undemocratic, militaristic, and unprogressive. This group was persuaded to sign the Treaty of Trianon by a trick and ever afterward repudiated it. Maurice Palaiolorgue, Secretary-General of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but acting on behalf of France's greatest industrialist, Eugene Schneider, made a deal with the Hungarians that if they would sign the Treaty of Trianon as it stood and give Schneider control of the Hungarian state railways, the port of Budapest, and the Hungarian General Credit Bank, which had a stranglehold on Hungarian industry, France would eventually make Hungary one of the mainstays of its anti-German bloc. In Eastern Europe, would sign a military convention with Hungary, and would, at the proper time, obtain a drastic revision of the Treaty of Trianon. The Hungarian side of this complex deal was largely carried out, but British and Italian objections to the extension of French economic control into Central Europe disrupted the negotiations and prevented Hungary from obtaining its reward. Palaiolorgue, although forced to resign and replaced at the Quai d'Orsay by the anti-Hungarian and pro-Czech Philippe Berthelot, received his reward from Schneider. He was made a director of Schneider's personal holding company for his Central European interests, the Union Européenne Industrielle et Financière. The Treaty of Sabris with Turkey was the last one made and the only one never ratified. There were 3 reasons for the delay. 1. The uncertainty about the role of the United States, which was expected to accept control of the Straits and a mandate for Armenia, thus forming a buffer against Soviet Russia. 2. The instability of the Turkish government, which was threatened by a nationalist uprising led by Mustafa Kemal. And 3. The scandal caused by the Bolshevik publication of the secret treaties regarding the Ottoman Empire, since these treaties contrasted so sharply with the expressed war aims of the Allies. The news that the United States refused to participate in the Near East settlement made it possible to draw up a treaty. This was begun by the Supreme Council at its London Conference of February 1920, and continued at San Remo in April. It was signed by the Sultan's government on August 20, 1920, but the nationalists under Mustafa Kemal refused to accept it and set up an insurgent government at Ankara. The Greeks and Italians, with Allied support, invaded Turkey and attempted to force the treaty on the nationalists, but they were much weakened by dissension behind the facade of Entente solidarity. The French believed that greater economic concessions could be obtained from the Kemalist government, while the British felt that richer prospects were to be obtained from the Sultan. In particular, the French were prepared to support the claims of Standard Oil to such concessions, while the British were prepared to support Royal Dutch Shell. The nationalist forces made good use of these dissensions. After buying off the Italians and French with economic concessions, they launched a counteroffensive against the Greeks. Although England came to the rescue of the Greeks, it received no support from the other powers, while the Turks had the support of Soviet Russia. The Turks destroyed the Greeks, burned Smyrna, and came face to face with the British at Chanak. At this critical moment, the Dominions, in answer to Curzon's telegraphed appeal, refused to support a war with Turkey. The Treaty of Sabris, already in tatters, had to be discarded. A new conference at Lausanne in November 1922 produced a moderate and negotiated treaty which was signed by the Kemalist government on July 24, 1923. This act ended, in a formal way, the First World War. It also took a most vital step toward establishing a new Turkey which would serve as a powerful force for peace and stability in the Near East. The decline of Turkey, which had continued for 400 years, was finally ended. By this Treaty of Lausanne, Turkey gave up all non-Turkish territory except Kurdistan, losing Arabia, Mesopotamia, the Levant, Western Thrace, and some islands of the Aegean. The capitulations were abolished in return for a promise of judicial reform. There were no reparations and no disarmament, except that the straits were demilitarized and were to be open to all ships except those of belligerents if Turkey was at war. Turkey accepted a minorities treaty and agreed to a compulsory exchange with Greece of Greek and Turkish minorities judged on the basis of membership in the Greek Orthodox or Muslim religions. Under this last provision, over 1,250,000 Greeks were removed from Turkey by 1930. Unfortunately, most of these had been urban shopkeepers in Turkey and were settled as farmers on the unhospitable soil of Macedonia. The Bulgarian peasants who had previously lived in Macedonia were unceremoniously dumped into Bulgaria, where they were tinder for the sparks of a revolutionary Bulgarian secret society called the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, IMRO, whose chief method of political action was assassination. As a result of the rising tide of aggression in the 1930s, the clause regarding the demilitarization of the Straits was revoked at the Montrose Convention of July 1936. This gave Turkey full sovereignty over the Straits, including the right to fortify them. All the original peace treaties consisted of 5 chief parts: a. the Covenant of the League of Nations, b. the territorial provisions, c. the disarmament provision, d. the reparations provisions, and e. penalties and guarantees. The first of these must be reserved until later, but the others should be mentioned here. In theory, the territorial provisions of the treaties were based on self-determination, but in fact they were usually based on other considerations: strategic, economic, punitive, legal, power, or compensation. By self-determination the peacemakers usually meant nationality, and by nationality they usually meant language, except in the Ottoman Empire where nationality usually meant religion. The 6 cases where self-determination, that is, plebiscites, was actually used showed that the peoples of these areas were not so nationalistic as the peacemakers believed. Because in Allenstein, where Polish-speaking people were 40% of the population, only 2% voted to join Poland, the area was returned to Germany. In Upper Silesia, where the comparable figures were 65% and 40%, the area was split, the more industrial eastern portion going to Poland, while the more rural western part was returned to Germany. In Klagenfurt, where Slovene speakers formed 68% of the population, only 40% wanted to join Yugoslavia, so the area was left in Austria. Somewhat similar results occurred in Marienwerder, but not in northern Schleswig, which voted to join Denmark. In each case, the voters, probably for economic reasons, chose to join the economically more prosperous state rather than the one sharing the same language. In addition to the areas mentioned, Germany had to return Alsace and Lorraine to France, give 3 small districts to Belgium, and abandon the northern edge of East Prussia around Memel to the Allied powers. This last area was given to the new state of Lithuania in 1924 by the Conference of Ambassadors. The chief territorial disputes arose over the Polish corridor, the Rhineland, and the Saar. The 14 points had promised to establish an independent Poland with access to the Baltic Sea. It had been French policy, since about 1500, to oppose any strong state in Central Europe by seeking allies in Eastern Europe. With the collapse of Russia in 1917, the French sought a substitute ally in Poland. Accordingly, Foch wanted to give all of East Prussia to Poland. Instead, the experts, who were very pro-Polish, gave Poland access to the sea by severing East Prussia from the rest of Germany by creating a Polish corridor in the valley of the Vistula. Most of the area was Polish-speaking, and German commerce with East Prussia was largely by sea. However, the city of Danzig, at the mouth of the Vistula, was clearly a German city. Lloyd George refused to give it to Poland. Instead, it was made a free city under the protection of the League of Nations. The French wished to detach the whole of Germany west of the Rhine, the so-called Rhineland, to create a separate state and increase French security against Germany. They gave up their separatist agitation in return for Wilson's promise of March 14, 1919 to give a joint Anglo-American guarantee against a German attack. This promise was signed in treaty form on June 28, 1919. But fell through when the United States Senate did not ratify the agreement. Since Clemenceau had been able to persuade Foch and Poincare to accept the Rhine settlement only because of this guarantee, its failure to materialize ended his political career. The Rhineland settlement as it stood had 2 quite separate provisions. On the one hand, the Rhineland and 3 bridgeheads on the right bank of the Rhine were to be occupied by Allied troops for from 5 to 15 years. On the other hand, the Rhineland and a zone 50 kilometers wide along the right bank were to be permanently demilitarized, and any violation of this could be regarded as a hostile act by the signers of the treaty. This meant that any German troops or fortifications were excluded from this area forever. This was the most important clause of the Treaty of Versailles. So long as it remained in effect, the great industrial region of the Ruhr on the right bank of the Rhine, the economic backbone of Germany's ability to wage warfare, was exposed to a quick French military thrust from the west, and Germany could not threaten France or move eastward against Czechoslovakia or Poland if France objected. Of these 2 clauses, the military occupation of the Rhineland and the bridgeheads was ended in 1930, 5 years ahead of schedule. This made it possible for Hitler to destroy the second provision, the demilitarization of Western Germany, by remilitarizing the area in March 1936. The last disputed territorial change of the Treaty of Versailles was concerned with the Saar Basin, rich in industry and coal. Although its population was clearly German, the French claimed most of it in 1919 on the grounds that 2/3 of it had been inside the French frontiers of 1814 and that they should obtain the coal mines as compensation for the French mines destroyed by the Germans in 1918. They did get the mines, but the area was separated politically from both countries to be ruled by the League of Nations for 15 years and then given a plebiscite. When the plebiscite was held in 1935, after an admirable League administration, only about 2,000 out of about 528,000 voted to join France, while about 90% wished to join Germany, the remainder indicating their desire to continue under League rule. The Germans, as a result of this vote, agreed to buy back the coal mines from France for 900 million francs, payable in coal over a 5-year period. The territorial provisions of the Treaties of Saint-Germain and Trianon were such as to destroy completely the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria was reduced from 115,000 square miles with 30 million inhabitants to 32,000 square miles with 6.5 million inhabitants. To Czechoslovakia went Bohemia, Moravia, parts of Lower Austria, and Austrian Silesia. To Yugoslavia went Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Dalmatia. To Romania went Bukovina. To Italy went South Tyrol, Trentino, Istria, and an extensive area north of the Adriatic, including Trieste. The Treaty of Trianon reduced Hungary from 125,000 square miles with 21 million inhabitants to 35,000 square miles with 8 million inhabitants. To Czechoslovakia went Slovakia and Ruthenia, to Romania went Transylvania, part of the Hungarian plain, and most of the Banat, to Yugoslavia went the rest of the Banat, Croatia, Slavonia, and some other districts. The treaties of peace set the boundaries of the defeated states but not those of the new states. These latter were fixed by a number of treaties made in the years following 1918. The process led to disputes and even to violent clashes of arms, and some issues are still subjects of discord to the present time. The most violent controversies arose in regard to the boundaries of Poland. Of these, only that with Germany was set by the Treaty of Versailles. The Poles refused to accept their other frontiers as suggested by the Allies at Paris, and by 1920 were at war with Lithuania over Vilna, with Russia over the eastern border, with the Ukrainians over Galicia, and with Czechoslovakia over Teschen. The struggle over Vilna began in 1919 when the Poles took the district from the Russians but soon lost it again. The Russians yielded it to the Lithuanians in 1920, and this was accepted by Poland, but within 3 months it was seized by Polish freebooters. A plebiscite, ordered by the League of Nations, was held in January 1922 under Polish control and gave a Polish majority. The Lithuanians refused to accept the validity of this vote or a decision of the Conference of Ambassadors of March 1923, giving the area to Poland. Instead, Lithuania continued to consider itself at war with Poland until December 1927. Poland did not fare so well at the other end of its frontier. Their fighting broke out between Czech and Polish forces over Teschen in January 1919. The Conference of Ambassadors divided the area between the two claimants, but gave the valuable coal mines to Czechoslovakia, July 1920. Poland's eastern frontier was settled only after a bloody war with the Soviet Union. The Supreme Council in December 1919 had laid down the so-called Curzon Line as the eastern boundary of Polish administration, but within 6 months the Polish armies had crossed this and advanced beyond Kiev. A Russian counterattack soon drove the Poles back, and Polish territory was invaded in its turn. The Poles appealed in panic to the Supreme Council, which was reluctant to intervene. The French, however, did not hesitate, and sent General Weygand with supplies to defend Warsaw. The Russian offensive was broken on the Vistula, and peace negotiations began. The final settlement, signed at Riga in March 1921, gave Poland a frontier 150 miles farther east than the Curzon Line and brought into Poland many non-Polish peoples, including 1 million White Russians and 4 million Ukrainians. Romania also had a dispute with Russia arising from the Romanian occupation of Bessarabia in 1918. In October 1920, the Conference of Ambassadors recognized Bessarabia as part of Romania. Russia protested, and the United States refused to accept the transfer. In view of these disturbances, Poland and Romania signed a defensive alliance against Russia in March 1921. The most important dispute of this kind arose over the disposition of fume. This problem was acute because one of the great powers was involved. The Italians had yielded fume to Yugoslavia in the Treaty of London of 1915 and had promised, in November 1918, to draw the Italian-Yugoslav boundary on lines of nationality. Thus they had little claim to fume. Nevertheless, at Paris they insisted on it, for political and economic reasons. Having just excluded the Habsburg Empire from the Adriatic Sea, and not wishing to see any new power rise in its place, they did all they could to hamper Yugoslavia and to curtail its access to the Adriatic. Moreover, the Italian acquisition of Trieste gave them a great seaport with no future, since it was separated by a political boundary from the hinterland whence it could draw its trade. To protect Trieste, Italy wanted to control all the possible competing ports in the area. The city of Fiume itself was largely Italian, but the suburbs and surrounding countryside were overwhelmingly Slav. The experts at Paris wished to give Italy neither Fiume nor Dalmatia, but Colonel House tried to overrule the experts in order to obtain Italian support for the League of Nations in return. Wilson overruled House and issued his famous appeal to the Italian people, which resulted in the temporary withdrawal of the Italian delegation from Paris. After their return, the issue was left unsettled. In September 1919, an erratic Italian poet, Gabriele D'Annunzio, with a band of freebooters, seized Fiume and set up an independent government on a comic opera basis. The dispute between Italy and Yugoslavia continued with decreasing bitterness until November 1920, when they signed a treaty at Rapallo dividing the area but leaving Fiume itself a free city. This settlement was not satisfactory. A group of fascists from Italy, where this party was not yet in office, seized the city in March 1922 and were removed by the Italian army 3 weeks later. The problem was finally settled by the Treaty of Rome of January 1924, by which Fiume was granted to Italy, but the suburb of Port Boros and a 50-year lease on one of the 3 harbour basins went to Yugoslavia. These territorial disputes are of importance because they continued to lacerate relationships between neighbouring states until well into the period of World War II and even later. The names of Fiume, Thrace, Bessarabia, Epirus, Transylvania, Memel, Vilna, Teschen, the Sa, Danzig, and Macedonia were still echoing as battle cries of overheated nationalists 20 years after the peace conference assembled at Paris. The work of that conference had undoubtedly reduced the numbers of minority peoples, but this had only served to increase the intensity of feeling of the minorities remaining. The numbers of these remained large. There were over 1 million Germans in Poland, 550,000 in Hungary, 3,100,000 in Czechoslovakia, about 700,000 in Romania, 500,000 in Yugoslavia, and 250,000 in Italy. There were 450,000 Magyars in Yugoslavia, 750,000 in Czechoslovakia, and about 1,500,000 in Romania. There were about 5 million White Russians and Ukrainians in Poland and about 1,100,000 of these in Romania. To protect these minorities, the Allied and associated powers forced the new states of Central and Eastern Europe to sign minority treaties, by which these minorities were granted a certain minimum of cultural and political rights. These treaties were guaranteed by the League of Nations, but there was no power to enforce observation of their terms. The most that could be done was to issue a public reprimand against the offending government, as was done, more than once, for example, against Poland. The disarmament provisions of the peace treaties were much easier to draw up than to enforce. It was clearly understood that the disarmament of the defeated powers was but the first step toward the general disarmament of the victor nations as well. In the case of the Germans, this connection was explicitly made in the treaty so that it was necessary, in order to keep Germany legally disarmed, for the other signers of the treaty to work constantly toward general disarmament after 1919, lest the Germans claim that they were no longer bound to remain disarmed. In all of the treaties, certain weapons like tanks, poisonous gas, airplanes, heavy artillery, and warships over a certain size, as well as all international trade in arms, were forbidden. Germany was allowed a small navy fixed in number and size of vessels, while Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria were allowed no navy worthy of the name. Each army was restricted in size, Germany to 100,000 men, Austria to 30,000, Hungary to 35,000, and Bulgaria to 20,000. Moreover, these men had to be volunteers on 12-year enlistments, and all compulsory military training, general staffs, or mobilization plans were forbidden. These training provisions were a mistake, forced through by the Anglo-Americans over the vigorous protests of the French. The Anglo-Americans regarded compulsory military training as militaristic. The French considered it the natural concomitant of universal manhood suffrage and had no objections to its use in Germany, since it would provide only a large number of poorly trained men. They did, however, object to the 12-year enlistment favored by the British, since this would provide Germany with a large number of highly trained men who could be used as officers in any revived German army. On this, as in so many issues where the French were overruled by the Anglo-Americans, time was to prove that the French position was correct. The reparations provisions of the treaties caused some of the most violent arguments at the peace conference and were a prolific source of controversy for more than a dozen years after the conference ended. The efforts of the Americans to establish some rational basis for reparations, either by an engineering survey of the actual damage to be repaired or an economic survey of Germany's capacity to pay reparations, were shunted aside, largely because of French objections. At the same time, American efforts to restrict reparations to war damages, and not allow them to be extended to cover the much larger total of war costs, were blocked by the British, who would have obtained much less under damages than under costs. By proving to the French that the German capacity to pay was, in fact, limited, and that the French would get a much larger fraction of Germany's payments under damages than under costs, the Americans were able to cut down on the British demands, although the South African delegate, General Smuts, was able to get military pensions inserted as one of the categories for which Germany had to pay. The French were torn between a desire to obtain as large a fraction as possible of Germany's payments and a desire to pile on Germany such a crushing burden of indebtedness that Germany would be ruined beyond the point where it could threaten French security again. The British delegation was sharply divided. The chief British financial delegates, Lords Cunliffe and Sumner, were so astronomically unrealistic in their estimates of Germany's ability to pay that they were called the Heavenly Twins, while many younger members of the delegation led by John Maynard, later Lord Keynes, either saw important economic limits on Germany's ability to pay or felt that a policy of fellowship and fraternity should incline Britain toward a low estimate of Germany's obligations. Feeling was so high on this issue that it proved impossible to set an exact figure for Germany's reparations in the treaty itself. Instead, a compromise, originally suggested by the American John Foster Dulles, was adopted. By this, Germany was forced to admit an unlimited, theoretical obligation to pay but was actually bound to pay for only a limited list of 10 categories of obligations. The former admission has gone down in history as the War Guilt Clause, Article 231 of the treaty. By it, Germany accepted the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. The following clause, Article 232, was concerned with the reparations obligation, listing 10 categories of damages, of which the 10th, concerned with pensions and inserted by General Smuts, represented a liability larger than the aggregate of the preceding 9 categories together. Since a considerable period was needed for the Reparations Commission to discover the value of these categories, the Germans were required to begin immediate delivery to the victors of large quantities of property, chiefly coal and timber. Only in May 1921 was the full reparations obligation presented to the Germans. Amounting to 132,000 million gold marks, about $32.5 billion, this bill was accepted by Germany under pressure of a 6-day ultimatum, which threatened to occupy the Ruhr Valley. The reparations clauses of the other treaties were of little significance. Austria was unable to pay any reparations because of the weakened economic condition of that stump of the Habsburg Empire. Bulgaria and Hungary paid only small fractions of their obligations before all reparations were wiped out in the financial debacle of 1931 to 1932. The treaties made at Paris had no enforcement provisions worthy of the name except for the highly inadequate Rhineland clauses which we have already mentioned. It is quite clear that the defeated powers could be made to fulfill the provisions of these treaties only if the coalition which had won the war were to continue to work as a unit. This did not occur. The United States left the coalition as a result of the Republican victory over Wilson in the congressional elections of 1918 and the presidential election of 1920. Italy was alienated by the failure of the treaty to satisfy her ambitions in the Mediterranean and Africa. But these were only details. If the Anglo-French Entente had been maintained, the treaties could have been enforced without either the United States or Italy. It was not maintained. Britain and France saw the world from points of view so different that it was almost impossible to believe that they were looking at the same world. The reason for this was simple, although it had many complex consequences and implications. Britain, after 1918, felt secure, while France felt completely insecure in the face of Germany. As a consequence of the war, even before the Treaty of Versailles was signed, Britain had obtained all her chief ambitions in respect to Germany. The German navy was at the bottom of Scapa Flow, scuttled by the Germans themselves, the German merchant fleet was scattered, captured, and destroyed, the German colonial rivalry was ended and its areas occupied, the German commercial rivalry was crippled by the loss of its patents and industrial techniques, the destruction of all its commercial outlets and banking connections throughout the world, and the loss of its rapidly growing pre-war markets. Britain had obtained these aims by December 1918 and needed no treaty to retain them. France, on the other hand, had not obtained the one thing it wanted: security. In population and industrial strength, Germany was far stronger than France, and still growing. It was evident that France had been able to defeat Germany only by a narrow margin in 1914 to 1918 and only because of the help of Britain, Russia, Italy, Belgium, and the United States. France had no guarantee that all these or even any of them would be at its side in any future war with Germany. In fact, it was quite clear that Russia and Italy would not be at its side. The refusal of the United States and Britain to give any guarantee to France against German aggression made it dubious that they would be ready to help either. Even if they were prepared to come to the rescue ultimately, there was no guarantee that France would be able to withstand the initial German assault in any future war as she had withstood, by the barest margin, the assault of 1914. Even if it could be withstood, and if Britain ultimately came to the rescue, France would have to fight, once again, as in the period 1914 to 1918, with the richest portion of France under enemy military occupation. In such circumstances, what guarantee would there be even of ultimate success? Doubts of this kind gave France a feeling of insecurity which practically became a psychosis, especially as France found its efforts to increase its security blocked at every turn by Britain. It seemed to France that the Treaty of Versailles, which had given Britain everything it could want from Germany, did not give France the one thing it wanted. As a result, it proved impossible to obtain any solution to the two other chief problems of international politics in the period 1919 to 1929. To these three problems of security, disarmament, and reparations, we now turn. Security, 1919 to 1935. France sought security after 1918 by a series of alternatives. As a first choice, it wanted to detach the Rhineland from Germany. This was prevented by the Anglo-Americans. As a second choice, France wanted a league with teeth, that is, a league of nations with an international police force empowered to take automatic and immediate action against an aggressor. This was blocked by the Anglo-Americans. As compensation for the loss of these first two choices, France accepted, as a third choice, an Anglo-American Treaty of Guarantee, but this was lost in 1919 by the refusal of the United States Senate to ratify the agreement and the refusal of Britain to assume the burden alone. In consequence, the French were forced back on a fourth choice: allies to the east of Germany. The chief steps in this were the creation of a Little Entente to enforce the Treaty of Trianon against Hungary in 1920 to 1921 and the bringing of France and Poland into this system to make it a coalition of satisfied powers. The Little Entente was formed by a series of bilateral alliances between Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. This was widened by a French-Polish treaty, February 1921, and a French-Czechoslovak treaty, January 1924. This system contributed relatively little to French security because of the weakness of these allies, except Czechoslovakia, and the opposition of Britain to any French pressure against Germany along the Rhine, the only way in which France could guarantee Poland or Czechoslovakia against Germany. In consequence, France continued its agitation both for a British guarantee and to put teeth into the League of Nations. Thus France wanted security, while Britain had security. France needed Britain, while Britain regarded France as a rival outside Europe, especially in the Near East, and the chief challenge to Britain's customary balance of power policy in Europe. After 1919, the British, and even some Americans, spoke of French hegemony on the continent of Europe. The first rule of British foreign policy for 4 centuries had been to oppose any hegemony on the continent and to do so by seeking to strengthen the second strongest power against the strongest. After 1919, Britain regarded Germany as the second strongest power and France as the strongest, a quite mistaken view in the light of the population, industrial productivity, and general organizations of the two countries. Because France lacked security, its chief concern in every issue was political. Because Britain had security, its chief concern was economic. The political desires of France required that Germany should be weakened, the economic desires of Britain required that Germany should be strengthened in order to increase the prosperity of all Europe. While the chief political threat to France was Germany, the chief economic and social threat to Britain was Bolshevism. In any struggle with Bolshevist Russia, Britain tended to regard Germany as a potential ally, especially if it were prosperous and powerful. This was the primary concern of Lord Dearborn, British ambassador in Berlin in the critical years 1920 to 1926. On the other hand, while France was completely opposed to the economic and social system of the Soviet Union and could not easily forget the immense French investments which had been lost in that country, it still tended to regard the Russians as potential allies against any revival of Germany, although France did not make an alliance with the Soviet Union until 1935. Because of its insecurity, France tended to regard the Treaty of Versailles as a permanent settlement, while Britain regarded it as a temporary arrangement subject to modification. Although dissatisfied with the treaty, France felt that it was the best it could hope to get, especially in view of the narrow margin by which Germany had decided to sign it, even when faced with a worldwide coalition. Britain, which had obtained all of her desires before the treaty was signed, had no reluctance to modify it, although it was only in 1935, with the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, that it attempted to modify the colonial, naval, or merchant marine clauses from which it had benefited. But in 1935 it had, for more than 15 years, been seeking to modify the clauses from which France had benefited. The French believed that peace in Europe was indivisible, while the British believed that it was divisible. That means that the French believed that the peace of Eastern Europe was a primary concern of the states of Western Europe and that the latter states could not allow Germany to move eastward because that would permit her to gain strength to strike back westward. The British believed that the peace of Eastern Europe and that of Western Europe were quite separate things and that it was their concern to maintain peace in the West, but that any effort to extend this to Eastern Europe would merely involve the West in every little squabble of these continually squabbling backward peoples and could, as happened in 1914, make a world war out of a local dispute. The Locano Pacts of 1925 were the first concrete achievement of this British point of view, as we shall see. To the French argument that Germany would get stronger and thus more able to strike westward if allowed to grow eastward, the British usually replied that the Germans were equally likely to become satisfied or get mired down in the great open spaces of the East. France believed that Germany could be made to keep the peace by duress, while Britain believed that Germany could be persuaded to keep the peace by concessions. The French, especially the political right in France, could see no difference between the Germans of the Empire and the Germans of the Weimar Republic. Scratch a German and you will find a Hun, they said. The British, especially the political left, regarded the Germans of the Weimar Republic as totally different from the Germans of the Empire, purified by suffering and freed from the tyranny of the imperial autocracy. They were prepared to clasp these new Germans to their hearts and to make any concession to encourage them to proceed on the path of democracy and liberalism. When the British began to talk in this fashion, appealing to high principles of international cooperation and conciliation, the French tended to regard them as hypocrites, pointing out that the British appeal to principles did not appear until British interests had been satisfied and until these principles could be used as obstacles to the satisfaction of French interests. The British tended to reply to the French remarks about the dangers of English hypocrisy with a few remarks of their own about the dangers of French militarism. In this sad fashion, the core of the coalition which had beaten Germany dissolved in a confusion of misunderstandings and recriminations. This contrast between the French and the British attitudes on foreign policy is an oversimplification of both. About 1935 there appeared a considerable change in both countries, and, long before that date, there were differences between different groups within each country. In both Britain and France, before 1935, there was a difference of opinion in international politics which followed general political outlooks, and even class lines, rather closely. In Britain, persons who were of the left tended to believe in revision of the Treaty of Versailles in favor of Germany, collective security, general disarmament, and friendship with the Soviet Union. In the same period, the right were impatient with policies based on humanitarianism, idealism, or friendship for the Soviet Union, and wanted to pursue a policy of national interest, by which they meant emphasis on strengthening the empire, conducting an aggressive commercial policy against outsiders, and adopting relative isolationism in general policy with no European political commitments except west of the Rhine, where Britain's interests were immediate. The groups of the left were in office in Britain for only about 2 years in the 20 years 1919 to 1939 and then only as a minority government, 1924, 1929 to 1931. The groups of the right were in power for 18 of these 20 years, usually with an absolute majority. However, during these 20 years the people of Britain were generally sympathetic to the point of view of the left in foreign policy, although they generally voted in elections on the basis of domestic rather than foreign politics. This means that the people were in favor of revision of Versailles, of collective security, of international cooperation, and of disarmament. Knowing this, the British governments of the right began to follow a double policy, a public policy in which they spoke loudly in support of what we have called the foreign policy of the left, and a secret policy in which they acted in support of what we have called the foreign policy of the right. Thus the stated policy of the government and the policy of the British people were based on support of the League of Nations, of international cooperation, and of disarmament. Yet the real policy was quite different. Also, after 1935, the policies of both right and left were changed, the left becoming anti-revisionist as early as 1934, continuing to support disarmament until, in some cases, the British governments of the right began to follow a double policy. Lord Curzon, who was Foreign Secretary for 4 years, 1919 to 1923, called the League of Nations a good joke. Britain rejected every effort of France and Czechoslovakia to strengthen the system of collective security, while openly supporting the Naval Disarmament Conference at Geneva, 1927, and the World Disarmament Conference, 1926 to 1935. Britain signed a secret agreement with France which blocked disarmament on land as well as on the sea, July 1928, and signed an agreement with Germany which released her from her naval disarmament, 1935. After 1935 the contrast between the public policy and the secret policy became so sharp that the authorized biographer of Lord Halifax, Foreign Secretary in 1938 to 1940, coined the name diarchy for it. Also, after 1935, the policies of both right and left were changed, the left becoming anti-revisionist as early as 1934, continuing to support disarmament until, in some cases, 1939, and strengthening its insistence on collective security, while the right became more insistent on revisionism, by that time called appeasement, and opposition to the Soviet Union. In France, the contrasts between right and left were less sharp than in Britain, and the exceptions more numerous, not only because of the comparative complexity of French political parties and political ideology, but also because foreign policy in France was not an academic or secondary issue but was an immediate, frightening concern of every Frenchman. Consequently, differences of opinion, however noisy and intense, were really rather slight. One thing all Frenchmen agreed upon: it must not happen again. Never again must the Hun be permitted to become strong enough to assault France as in 1870 and in 1914. To prevent this, the right and the left agreed, there were two methods: by the collective action of all nations and by France's own military power. The two sides differed in the order in which these two should be used, the left wanting to use collective action first and France's own power as a supplement or a substitute, the right wanting to use France's own power first, with support from the League or other allies as a supplement. In addition, the left tried to distinguish between the old Imperial Germany and the new Republican Germany, hoping to placate the latter and turn its mind away from revisionism by cooperative friendship and collective action. The right, on the other hand, found it impossible to distinguish one Germany from another or even one German from another, believing that all were equally incapable of understanding any policy but force. Accordingly, the right wanted to use force to compel Germany to fulfill the Treaty of Versailles, even if France had to act alone. The policy of the right was the policy of Poincaré and Barthou, the policy of the left was the policy of Briand. The former was used in 1918 to 1924 and, briefly, in 1934 to 1935, the latter was used in 1924 to 1929. The policy of the right failed in 1924 when Poincaré's occupation of the Ruhr in order to force Germany to pay reparations was ended. This showed that France could not act alone even against a weak Germany because of the opposition of Britain and the danger of alienating world opinion. Accordingly, France turned to a policy of the left, 1924 to 1929. In this period, which is known as the period of fulfillment, Briand, as Foreign Minister of France, and Stresemann, as Foreign Minister of Germany, cooperated in friendly terms. This period ended in 1929, not, as is usually said, because Stresemann died and Briand fell from office, but because of a growing realization that the whole policy of fulfillment, 1924 to 1929, had been based on a misunderstanding. Briand followed a policy of conciliation toward Germany in order to win Germany from any desire to revise Versailles. Stresemann followed his policy of fulfillment toward France in order to win from France a revision of the treaty. It was a relationship of cross-purposes, because on the crucial issue, revision of Versailles, Briand stood adamant, like most Frenchmen, and Stresemann was irreconcilable, like most Germans. In France, as a result of the failure of the policy of the right in 1924 and of the policy of the left in 1929, it became clear that France could not act alone toward Germany. It became clear that France did not have freedom of action in foreign affairs and was dependent on Britain for its security. To win this support, which Britain always held out as bait but did not give until 1939, Britain forced France to adopt the policy of appeasement of the British right after 1935. This change was made on a poor issue, Poland, 1939, after the possibility This policy forced France to give away every advantage which it held over Germany. Germany was allowed to rearm, 1935, Germany was allowed to remilitarize the Rhineland, 1936, Italy was alienated, 1935, France lost its last secure land frontier, Spain, 1936 to 1939, France lost all her allies to the east of Germany, including her one strong ally, Czechoslovakia, 1938 to 1939, France had to accept the union of Austria with Germany which she had vetoed in 1931, March 1938, the power and prestige of the League of Nations was broken and the whole system of collective security abandoned, 1931 to 1939, the Soviet Union, which had allied with France and Czechoslovakia against Germany in 1935, was treated as a pariah among nations and lost to the anti-German coalition, 1937 to 1939. And finally, when all these had been lost, public opinion in England forced the British government to abandon the right's policy of appeasement and adopt the old French policy of resistance. This change was made on a poor issue, Poland, 1939, after the possibility of using the policy of resistance had been destroyed by Britain and after France itself had almost abandoned it. In France, as in Britain, there were changes in the foreign policies of the right and the left after Hitler came to power in Germany, 1933. The left became more anti-German and abandoned Bryan's policy of conciliation, while the right, in some sections, sought to make a virtue of necessity and began to toy with the idea that, if Germany was to become strong anyway, a solution to the French problem of security might be found by turning Germany against the Soviet Union. This idea, which already had adherents in the right in Britain, was more acceptable to the right than to the left in France, because, while the right was conscious of the political threat from Germany, it was equally conscious of the social and economic threat from Bolshevism. Some members of the right in France even went so far as to picture France as an ally of Germany in the assault on the Soviet Union. On the other hand, many persons of the right in France continued to insist that the chief, or even the only, threat to France was from the danger of German aggression. In France, as in Britain, there appeared a double policy, but only after 1935, and, even then, it was more of an attempt to pretend that France was following a policy of her own instead of a policy made in Britain than it was an attempt to pretend it was following a policy of loyalty to collective security and French allies rather than a policy of appeasement. While France continued to talk of her international obligations, of collective security, and of the sanctity of treaties, especially Versailles, this was largely for public consumption, for in fact from the autumn of 1935 to the spring of 1940 France had no policy in Europe independent of Britain's policy of appeasement. Thus French foreign policy in the whole period 1919 to 1939 was dominated by the problem of security. These 20 years can be divided into 5 subperiods as follows. 1919 to 1924, policy of the right. 1924 to 1929, policy of the left. 1929 to 1934, confusion and transition. 1934 to 1935, policy of the right. 1935 to 1939, dual policy of appeasement. The French feeling that they lacked security was so powerful in 1919 that they were quite willing to sacrifice the sovereignty of the French state and its freedom of action in order to get a League of Nations possessing the powers of a world government. Accordingly, at the first meeting of the League of Nations Committee at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, the French tried to establish a league with its own army, its own general staff, and its own powers of police action against aggressors without the permission of the member states. The Anglo-Americans were horrified at what they regarded as an inexcusable example of power politics and militarism. They rode roughshod over the French and drew up their own draft covenant in which there was no sacrifice of state sovereignty and where the New World Organization had no powers of its own and no right to take action without the consent of the parties concerned. War was not outlawed but merely subjected to certain procedural delays in making it, nor were peaceful procedures for settling international disputes made compulsory but instead were merely provided for those who wished to use them. Finally, no real political sanctions were provided to force nations to use peaceful procedures or even to use the delaying procedures of the covenant itself. Economic sanctions were expected to be used by member nations against aggressor states which violated the delaying procedures of the covenant, but no military sanctions could be used except as contributed by each state itself. The League was thus far from being a world government, although both its friends and its enemies, for opposite reasons, tried to pretend that it was more powerful, and more important, than it really was. The Covenant, especially the critical Articles 10 to 16, had been worded by a skillful British lawyer, Cecil Hurst, who filled it with loopholes cleverly concealed under a mass of impressive verbiage, so that no state's freedom of action was vitally restricted by the document. The politicians knew this, although it was not widely publicized and, from the beginning, those states which wanted a real international organization began to seek to amend the covenant, to plug the loopholes in it. Any real international political organization needed three things: 1. Peaceful procedures for settling all disputes, 2. Outlawry of non-peaceful procedures for this purpose, and 3. Effective military sanctions to compel use of the peaceful procedures and to prevent the use of warlike procedures. The League of Nations consisted of three parts. 1. The assembly of all members of the League, meeting generally in September of each year. 2. The Council, consisting of the great powers with permanent seats and a number of lesser powers holding elective seats for 3-year terms. And 3. The Secretariat, consisting of an international bureaucracy devoted to all kinds of international cooperation and having its headquarters in Geneva. The Assembly, in spite of its large numbers and its infrequent meetings, proved to be a lively and valuable institution, full of hard-working and ingenious members, especially from the secondary powers like Spain, Greece, and Czechoslovakia. The Council was less effective, was dominated by the great powers, and spent much of its time trying to prevent action without being too obvious about it. Originally, it consisted of 4 permanent and 4 non-permanent members, the former including Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. Germany was added in 1926, Japan and Germany withdrew in 1933, the Soviet Union was admitted in 1934 and was expelled in 1939 after its attack on Finland. Since the number of non-permanent members was increased during this period, the Council ended up in 1940 with 2 permanent and 11 non-permanent members. The Secretariat was slowly built up and, by 1938, consisted of more than 800 persons from 52 countries. Most of these were idealistically devoted to the principles of international cooperation, and displayed considerable ability and amazing loyalty during the brief existence of the League. They were concerned with every type of international activity, including disarmament, child welfare, education, the drug traffic, slavery, refugees, minorities, the codification of international law, the protection of wildlife and natural resources, cultural cooperation, and many others. Attached to the League were a number of dependent organizations. 2. The Permanent Court of International Justice and the International Labour Office were semi-autonomous. Others included the Economic and Financial Organization, the Organization for Communications and Transit, the International Health Organization with offices in Paris, and the Intellectual Cooperation Organization with branches in Paris, Geneva, and Rome. Many efforts were made, chiefly by France and Czechoslovakia, to plug the gaps in the covenant. The chief of these were the Draft Treaty of Mutual Assistance, 1923, the Geneva Protocol, 1924, and the Locano Pacts, 1925. The draft treaty bound its signers to renounce aggressive war as an international crime and to bring military assistance to any signer the Council of the League designated to be the victim of an aggression. This project was destroyed in 1924 by the veto of the British Labour government on the grounds that the agreement would increase the burden on the British Empire without increasing its security. The Assembly at once formulated a better agreement known as the Geneva Protocol. This sought to plug all the gaps in the covenant. It bound its signers to settle international disputes by methods provided in the treaty, defined as aggressor any state which refused to use these peaceful procedures, bound its members to use military sanctions against such aggressors, and ended the veto power in the Council by providing that the necessary unanimity for Council decisions could be achieved without counting the votes of the parties to the dispute. This agreement was destroyed by the objections of a newly installed Conservative government in London. The chief British opposition to the protocol came from the Dominions, especially from Canada, which feared that the agreement might force them, at some time, to apply sanctions against the United States. This was a very remote possibility in view of the fact that the British Commonwealth generally had 2 seats on the Council and one at least could use its vote to prevent action even if the vote of the other was nullified by being a party to the dispute. The fact that both the draft treaty and the Geneva Protocol had been destroyed by Britain led to an adverse public opinion throughout the world. To counteract this, the British devised a complicated alternative known as the Locano Pacts. Conceived in the same London circles which had been opposing France, supporting Germany, and sabotaging the League, the Locano Pacts were the result of a complex international intrigue in which General Smuts played a chief role. On the face of it, these agreements appeared to guarantee the Rhine frontiers, to provide peaceful procedures for all disputes between Germany and her neighbors, and to admit Germany to the League of Nations on a basis of equality with the great powers. This meant that if any one of the three frontier powers violated the frontier or throughout the world,